My name is Teresa Whitmore. I am 68 years old, a widow, a mother, and for most of my life, a quiet builder of other people's happiness. I never chased the spotlight. I spent decades working behind the scenes, running estates, restoring old houses, and turning forgotten places into sanctuaries. People came to celebrate milestones in the very halls I cared for. They laughed under chandeliers I polished. They toasted in gardens I kept alive. Yet the moment that changed everything was not inside a ballroom, not during a gala or festival. It came on a Tuesday afternoon with a single text from my only son. "Mom, please don't come. It will ruin the mood." I read it again and again, as if maybe I had misunderstood. But no, those words were deliberate. Not a mistake, not an accident of tone. Just cold enough to slice, just polite enough to leave no trace of guilt. Please don't come. My son was getting married, and his new life, apparently, had no place for me. For 3 nights, I barely slept. I replayed his childhood in my mind. The nights I rocked him through fevers, the mornings I packed his lunches while my own hair still damp from the shower. I remembered Michael, my husband, saying once, "One day he'll see that every wall we built was for him." But now, decades later, the child we sacrificed everything for was telling me that my presence would ruin the mood. The 4th morning, the phone rang. A voice, cheerful and professional, filled my kitchen. "Hi, Mrs. Whitmore. Just confirming we received the $50,000 deposit. The couple has decided to upgrade the venue to accommodate a jazz band. It's going to be stunning." I sat very still, my hand brushing the embroidered handkerchief folded on the table beside me. Michael had given it to me on our 10th anniversary. Over the years, it had dried tears, wiped scraped knees, and steadied my trembling hands. That morning, I pressed it to my palm as if it carried his voice. "Actually," I said softly, "cancel everything." There was a pause, the kind that hums with disbelief. The planner's tone cracked. "I'm sorry? Ma'am, you're not the bride." I did not raise my voice. I did not explain myself in a rush. I simply let the silence expand until her words withered. Then, calmly, I answered, "No, I am the one who owns the $35 million estate they rented. I also own the catering company you contracted and the hotel chain where their 200 guests are supposed to stay." The silence on the other end grew heavy. I placed the handkerchief down gently beside my teacup. My son had erased me from his wedding. But in that moment, I realized I had the power to erase the wedding itself. And I did not need to shout. I did not need to fight. All I had to do was close my hand around the truth that had always been mine. That is where this story begins. Not with a celebration, not with a proposal, not even with love, but with absence. With a mother written out of her own son's most important day, and with the quiet decision to draw a line, not out of spite, not out of vengeance, but out of dignity. I know some of you listening may wonder if I went too far. Maybe you are already whispering to yourself, "I could never do that to my child." But stay with me. Hear the whole story. Because nothing in life is ever as simple as one text message, one phone call, one signature. This began years ago, with sacrifices that left me invisible, with choices that carved silence into my skin, with a love that was unconditional until someone decided it was inconvenient. That day, with the planner's voice still ringing in my ear, I realized something profound. Silence can wound, but silence can also protect. My son believed removing me would make his world more perfect. He never imagined that the world he was standing on was mine to begin with. So I smiled, and I said once more, cancel everything. I was not always the woman who signed contracts for estates worth millions. Long before I held keys to ballrooms and gardens, I was simply Teresa, a young girl who believed that love was enough to build a life. I met Michael when I was 20. He was older by 5 years, a man with calloused hands and bright eyes, already dreaming of restoring a crumbling farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Everyone thought it was foolish. The roof leaked, the windows rattled, the land was more weeds than grass. But I saw what he saw, the bones of something that could last. We married in that half-broken house. My dress was borrowed. The flowers were picked from the side of the road. Michael promised me then, in front of a handful of friends, one day, this will be more than a home. It will be a place people come to celebrate. His faith was unshakable, and I matched it with my labor. I painted walls until my knuckles blistered. I cleaned until my lungs burned from dust. There were winters we huddled by a single heater, wrapped in blankets, whispering plans of gardens and terraces. We did not have much, but we had vision, and we had each other. When Daniel was born, I learned a different kind of devotion. The farmhouse was still modest then, but his crib sat under the very window we once patched with plastic. I remember standing there in the middle of the night, rocking him while Michael sketched blueprints on the kitchen table. I could hear his pencil scratching paper, the rhythm steady as my son's breathing against my chest. We were building two things at once, a family and a future. Over the years, the farmhouse became Whitmore Estate. Brick by brick, acre by acre, it transformed. Michael managed the construction, and I managed everything else. I handled books, vendors, events. I learned how to negotiate without shouting, how to command respect without raising my tone. We hosted our first wedding when Daniel was 8. I still remember him tugging my hand as the bride walked past, whispering, "Mom, one day I'll give you a wedding this beautiful." I smiled then, not knowing how bitterly those words would return decades later. Life was not easy. There were years when money was scarce, when we mortgaged every inch of land just to keep going. I sewed Daniel's school clothes, cut my own hair in the mirror, and skipped meals so the men working construction could be fed. Yet I never resented it. I thought sacrifice was the price of love. Michael and I often said, "If we build with heart, it will last." That became our motto, scribbled on scraps of paper and tucked into drawers. But time is cruel. Michael grew ill in his late 50s. At first, it was fatigue, then weakness, then long stays in the hospital. I watched the man who carried beams on his shoulders reduced to a frail body in a bed. On the night he passed, I held his hand and whispered that I would keep the estate alive. He nodded once, too weak for words, but his eyes told me he believed. When I returned home from the hospital, I found his last note folded under my pillow. It read, "Protect what we built. It will protect you." And so I did. I became the sole steward of Whitmore Estate. People assumed I would sell. A widow with a young adult son. What else could I do? But I stayed. I worked harder than I thought possible. I balanced ledgers by candlelight. I signed every check with Michael's old fountain pen, the ink blotting the pages with quiet determination. Slowly, the estate flourished. Weddings doubled, then tripled. Corporate retreats booked months in advance. The farmhouse of our youth had become a jewel in the county. Daniel grew alongside the estate, though in a different direction. He left for college, then law school. He wore tailored suits while I wore aprons. He spoke about mergers and deals while I spoke about flowers and lighting. Still, I believed our worlds would always meet in love. I never imagined that the boy who once promised me a wedding this beautiful would be the man to tell me not to come to his own. Looking back now, I see the seeds of distance already planted. Daniel grew up surrounded by wealth that he did not remember we once lived without. He never saw the winters of empty cupboards or the summers of debt. He only saw the final result: marble floors, fountains, chandeliers. Perhaps that is why he mistook the estate as a backdrop rather than a lifeline. To him, it was luxury. To me, it was survival. As I sit here recalling those years, I can almost smell the dust of the old farmhouse, the sweat on Michael's shirt, the baby powder clinging to Daniel's hair. I can feel the handkerchief Michael embroidered for me, pressed against my palm as a reminder of the vows we made. If I close my eyes, I hear his voice, steady and sure, telling me once again, if we build with heart, it will last. The estate lasted. My love lasted. What I did not expect was how fragile the bond with my son could be. As Daniel grew older, I noticed the distance forming, though at first it was subtle, like hairline cracks in a wall you think will never matter. He left for college out of state, eager to escape the quiet town and the estate that had defined our lives. I told myself it was natural. Every young man needed to find his own way. I encouraged him, sent care packages filled with cookies and notes, and reminded him that no matter how far he went, home would always be waiting. When he returned during holidays, he carried himself differently. He wore sharp suits, spoke with a faster cadence, and rolled his eyes at the slow rhythm of small-town life. He called Whitmore Estate quaint, as if the chandeliers we polished and the gardens we watered were merely props for photographs, not the blood and sweat of decades. I told myself again it was fine. A son's pride should grow beyond his mother's reach. Still, each time he dismissed the estate, it felt like a dismissal of me. Then came Sophia. She entered his life like a storm dressed in silk. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was polished, ambitious, and relentless in her pursuit of appearances. She worked in public relations, her days spent curating images, managing reputations, arranging stories to gleam in magazines. When I first met her, she extended a manicured hand and smiled thinly, her eyes sweeping across me like she was measuring fabric. "It's lovely to finally meet you, Mrs. Whitmore," she said, though her tone suggested she had already formed an opinion. During that dinner, she spoke endlessly about branding, networking, and the importance of first impressions. She praised Daniel's career trajectory, his growing connections, his promise to climb higher still. I listened quietly, nodding at appropriate moments, though I felt increasingly invisible. At one point, she turned to him, ignoring me altogether, and said, "You have everything it takes to move into the circles you deserve. We just need to keep things consistent." Consistent, I realized, was her word for perfect. And perfect, in her dictionary, meant curated. Afterward, Margaret, my sister-in-law and one of the few people who truly knew me, leaned over in the kitchen as we cleared dishes. "Teresa," she whispered, "that girl is going to write the family album without a single page about you if you're not careful." I forced a laugh, but her words lodged deep inside me. Sophia's influence grew quickly. She redecorated Daniel's apartment, replaced his wardrobe, and suggested he avoid old friends who didn't fit the image. When they visited the estate together, she looked around with an appraising eye, her voice sugar-coated but sharp. "This place is charming," she said, "but perhaps a little outdated for high-end weddings, don't you think?" Outdated. The same halls where Michael and I had poured our lives. The same gardens where Daniel once ran barefoot. Now reduced to a backdrop that did not meet her standard. Daniel laughed lightly, as if her comment was harmless, but I felt the shift. He was beginning to see the estate through her lens. I watched him glance at peeling paint or aging stone with sudden embarrassment, as though he had never noticed before. And I realized with a quiet ache that the foundation of his identity was no longer home. It was her approval. The true break came one evening when he called, his voice crisp, rehearsed. "Mom," he said, "Sophia and I have been thinking. For the wedding, we want something very polished, very modern. The estate might not be the right fit." I bit my tongue, though my chest tightened. "Of course, Daniel," I replied. "It's your wedding. You should have what you want." There was relief in his sigh, as if I had passed a test. But under that relief, I heard something colder, the assumption that I would simply step aside. From that moment, the invitation slowed. Holidays were spent elsewhere. Conversations were shorter, punctuated by Sophia's voice in the background. Margaret noticed too. Over tea, she said, "He loves you, Teresa, but he's ashamed of needing you. That girl tells him strength means cutting ties, not remembering roots." I held the handkerchief Michael embroidered, folding its edges again and again. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the son I had raised with lullabies and sacrifices now saw me as part of a life he had outgrown. I did not fight it. I told myself silence was strength, that love did not beg. But deep inside, the cracks widened until one day they became a chasm. It was the day I received the message that I was not welcome at his wedding. By then, I should have been prepared, yet nothing prepares a mother for erasure. The message arrived on a gray afternoon. I was sitting by the window, folding linens for an upcoming charity banquet, when my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was a simple update from Daniel about the wedding schedule. Instead, it was a text so short, so clean, it felt like a blade. "Mom, please don't come. It will ruin the mood." I read it once, then again, then a third time. My hands stilled over the fabric in my lap. The words refused to shift, no matter how many times I blinked. "Please don't come. It will ruin the mood." My chest tightened, and for a moment, I could not breathe. I pressed the linen against my heart, as if cloth could steady a wound no one could see. The first thought was disbelief. Surely he meant something else. Perhaps it was Sophia who had borrowed his phone. Perhaps it was a cruel joke. I stared at the screen, waiting for another message, some correction, some reassurance. None came, only silence. The second thought was memory. I saw Daniel at 5 years old, climbing into my lap with sticky hands after playing outside. "Mom," he had said, "when I grow up, you'll always sit in the front row, right? At my graduation, at my wedding, at everything." His eyes had shone with certainty. He had wrapped his little arms around my neck, sealing a promise that now shattered with a single text. My phone slipped from my hand and landed on the floor with a dull thud. I sat motionless, staring at the wooden planks beneath my feet. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Each tick seemed louder than the last, marking time that no longer felt like mine. Eventually, I picked up the phone again. The message still waited there, merciless and absolute. I thought of replying, demanding an explanation, pleading for clarity, but my fingers refused to move. What words could undo what was already done? I imagined typing, Daniel, I raised you, I fed you, I carried you when no one else could. How could you erase me? But even as the thought formed, I knew it would sound like begging. And I had promised myself long ago never to beg for love. Instead, I walked to the kitchen and filled the kettle. The act was mechanical, a way to keep my hands from trembling. As the water heated, I unfolded Michael's handkerchief and pressed it to my lips. He had embroidered our initials into the corner the year Daniel was born. That fabric had soaked my tears when Michael died. Now it absorbed the ones I could not let fall. When the kettle whistled, I poured the water into a cup, watching steam rise like smoke from something burning. I sat at the table, my hands wrapped around the porcelain, and tried to breathe. My reflection wavered in the surface of the tea, blurred and distorted. For the first time, I wondered if my son saw me the same way. Blurred, distorted, no longer fitting into the image he wanted. The shock slowly hardened into something else. Not rage, not even sorrow. It was emptiness, a hollow space where a mother's pride used to live. Silence filled that space, heavy and sharp. I realized then, the cruelest erasure is not absence of love, but the decision to remove someone as if they were never there. Later that evening, Margaret came by to drop off a casserole. She found me still at the table, the tea cold, the handkerchief clenched in my fist. I showed her the message. Her eyes darkened, and she shook her head. Teresa, I warned you. Sophia doesn't want you in the picture. I know, I whispered. My voice sounded foreign, like it belonged to someone else. What are you going to do? Margaret asked gently. I folded the handkerchief once more, slow and deliberate, until it was a perfect square. Nothing, I said. For now, nothing. But deep inside, beneath the layers of restraint, I felt a shift. A quiet line had been drawn. My son had told me I would ruin the mood. He had erased me from his celebration. What he did not know was that the very foundation of that celebration, the venue, the contracts, the walls he took for granted, rested in my hands. I did not reply to his message. I did not argue or plead. I let the silence speak, because sometimes silence is sharper than any reply. The morning after that text, my phone rang again. I had barely slept. The words, "Please don't come," had carved themselves into my mind, echoing each time I closed my eyes. My body felt heavy, but my instincts kept me moving. I brewed tea, folded the same handkerchief in my hand, and tried to anchor myself in routine. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer, but I did. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," a bright voice chirped. "I'm calling to confirm details for the Whitmore Estate reservation. The deposit of $50,000 has been processed, and we've upgraded the package to include live jazz and additional floral arrangements. The couple is thrilled." The woman on the other end was efficient, cheerful, utterly unaware of the storm raging inside my chest. I let her words spill into the quiet of my kitchen, every detail stabbing at me. Jazz, flowers, thrilled. Thrilled while I was uninvited. Thrilled while I was erased. I pressed the handkerchief against my palm and closed my eyes. My voice came low, steady. "Cancel everything." There was silence, then a nervous laugh. "I'm sorry. Did you mean the upgrades, Mrs. Whitmore? Because the deposit is non-refundable." "No," I said, my tone even, each word deliberate. "I mean everything, the entire event. Cancel it." The planner sputtered, caught between professionalism and confusion. "But ma'am, you're not the bride." For the first time in days, I felt a strange calm settle over me. like the air just before rain. I opened my eyes and looked around the kitchen, the worn wooden table, the kettle cooling on the stove, the sunlight spilling through curtains I had sewn myself. This was my domain, my life, my legacy. "You're right," I told her. "I am not the bride. I am the owner of the $35 million estate you booked. I also own the catering company you've contracted and the hotel chain that holds every reservation for their guests." The silence on the line deepened, weighted and sharp. I imagined her face, pale, her pen frozen above a notepad. Finally, she stammered, I wasn't aware." "Few people are," I replied, "but I am aware. And I am telling you, cancel everything." I ended the call before she could gather herself. My hand trembled as I set the phone on the table, though not from fear. It was the tremble of release, of finally choosing dignity over desperation. For the first time since Michael's death, I felt him close. I could almost hear his voice, steady and practical. "Protect what we built. It will protect you." I sat back, breathing slowly. I was not loud. I was not cruel. I did not call my son to announce what I had done. I simply acted. The power of silence was that it needed no witness. A part of me ached at the thought of Daniel's reaction. He would be furious. He would see this as sabotage, betrayal, maybe even vengeance. But it was none of those. I did not destroy his wedding. I withdrew my consent from being erased. The foundation of their grand celebration had always been mine. They had forgotten that. I simply reminded them in the clearest way possible. Later that morning, Margaret stopped by. She saw the look on my face before I spoke. "You did something," she said softly. I told her. She listened without judgment, her eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing every word. Then she placed a hand on mine. "Teresa, sometimes silence is the loudest protest. You didn't scream. You didn't curse. You just told the truth." I nodded, though a hollow ache pulsed in my chest. "Do you think he'll hate me for it?" Margaret sighed. "Maybe for a while. But hate is not the same as forgetting. You gave him something he cannot ignore. Whether he learns from it is up to him." That night, as I folded the linens again, I thought of the text, the phone call, the planner's shocked silence. I thought of Daniel standing at the altar without the grand backdrop he had taken for granted. And I thought of Michael, whose faith had carried me this far. I pressed the handkerchief to my lips once more and whispered, "I didn't cancel his wedding. I canceled my erasure." And in that quiet declaration, I felt the strength to face whatever storm was coming. I keep Michael close by telling the long version that begins before money and ends with a promise. I was 20 when I met him. He was 25 with sunburned forearms and a notebook of measurements. He had just bought a ruined farmhouse on the edge of town. The roof sagged. The porch leaned. Wind slid through broken panes like a whistle at midnight. He ran his hand over a cracked beam and said, calm as a prayer, "This will hold." I believed him because he believed the place could love us back. We learned each other through labor. He showed me how to read grain in old wood. I taught him how to stretch a dollar until it squeaked. We painted after dark with lamps clamped to ladders. We ate in shifts. We argued in sawdust and made up over black coffee at dawn. He kept a battered fountain pen in his shirt pocket and wrote everything down. When the pen scratched across paper, the house seemed to listen. Our first winter was merciless. Pipes froze. A raccoon raided the pantry. We rationed heat with quilts tacked over doors. Yet radiance found us. He wired the front room and flipped the switch. Light spilled across the plaster like water. That night he said, "If we build with heart, it will last." When Daniel arrived, the farmhouse became a cradle. Michael held him as if the baby were a contract he was sworn to honor. He installed a window above the crib. Morning light came thin and gold. I learned a rhythm that would define my life. Rock the child. Balance the books. Answer vendors. Hold the ladder. Start again. Whitmore Estate began with 3 rooms and a borrowed tent. A retired teacher asked to host her 50th anniversary in our field. She paid in cash and pies. We strung thrifted lights. Michael tuned a salvaged fountain. I ironed linens on the counter. Inquiries filled our machine. By fall, we had bookings through winter. Success did not arrive like a wave. It inched toward us like tide and sometimes retreated. A storm tore shingles. A shipment of marble arrived cracked. A lender reneged. Michael never dramatized setbacks. He sharpened a pencil, opened his ledger, asked for the real numbers, then said, "We will do the next honest thing." I learned that courage can be quiet. The illness announced itself without manners. He tired in the afternoons. He set his hammer down to rub a hand over his heart. He called it age until I insisted on tests. Waiting rooms, new language that did not belong in our mouths. He apologized to me in a parking garage for nothing he had done wrong. I kept the handkerchief he embroidered in my pocket and pretended I needed it for the wind. Hospitals have sounds that become your clock. Machines sighed, wheels clicked, soft shoes skimmed careful floors. I read contracts beside his bed and signed checks with his fountain pen. One evening, he asked for the pen. He wrote 3 lines on a page from my planner. Protect what we built. Teach Daniel the difference between gloss and grace. Choose peace when you can. He underlined peace twice. On the last night, I lay next to him with my head on his shoulder. He whispered that he could see the farmhouse as it had been and as it was. His voice steadied as he said my name. I said I would carry the whole thing if I had to. He nodded. His breath quieted. The machines kept busy, while the important work slipped beyond their reach. The estate documents were ready. He had placed everything in my name months before. It was not romance. It was respect. After the funeral, I met the banker in a plain office and signed with the same pen. My hand did not shake. I did not tell Daniel every detail. He was still becoming himself. He did not need the weight of the ledger or the bitterness of the risks we took. I wanted him to study, to travel, to speak in rooms where no one knew his mother had once hammered roofs at dusk. Perhaps that was my mistake. Perhaps I should have shown him the scar beneath the marble. Now, when I fold linens or check a contract, I keep the pen and the handkerchief together in the top drawer. One marks, one mends. When I told the planner to cancel everything, I was not cruel. I was faithful to a memory and to a promise written in a tired man's careful hand. If we build with heart, it will last. It did last. What needed to change was who remembered the cost. Michael would have approved this. When Sophia truly entered my life, it was not with warmth, but with calculation. I remember the first dinner we shared after Daniel brought her home. She wore a dress the color of champagne, her nails perfectly polished, her smile flawless but thin, as if practiced in a mirror. She leaned across the table, shook my hand, and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, it's an honor." Yet her eyes told a different story. They flicked over the room, the wood paneling, the framed photographs, the vase of lilies I had cut myself, as though she were conducting an appraisal, rather than a greeting. Throughout the meal, she asked questions, but not about me. Not about how Michael and I had built the estate from dust. Not about my years balancing books and carrying bricks. Her questions circled Daniel's career, his future, their wedding. She used words like elevated, exclusive, and prestige, each syllable deliberate. I sat quietly, letting her monologue wash over me, but Margaret, who had joined us, caught my eye from across the table. Her expression was wary. Later, in the kitchen, Margaret whispered while we cleared plates. "She doesn't see you, Teresa. She sees a version of family that photographs well. Be careful. She'll cut out whatever doesn't fit the frame." I brushed it off then, though the warning nestled uncomfortably in my chest. As months passed, Sophia's presence became a constant shadow. She redecorated Daniel's apartment, replacing the sturdy oak table I had given him with glass and chrome. She organized his wardrobe, discarding the shirts I had sewn in lean years. She even critiqued his old friends, telling him they were sweet but off-brand. The word struck me, off-brand, as though people were products on a shelf. Her influence extended to the estate itself. During a visit, she strolled through the ballroom with her heels clicking against the marble. "Charming," she said, her tone bright but dismissive, though perhaps a little outdated for what we envision. High-end weddings need freshness. I bit my tongue, feeling heat rise in my chest. That marble floor had been laid by Michael's hands, polished by mine until it gleamed. Outdated, she had called it. Outdated, like me. Daniel laughed lightly, placing an arm around her shoulders. "She has a point, Mom. Couples want something sleek these days." His words cut deeper than he realized. I smiled faintly, not trusting myself to answer. The silence stretched between us, weighted and cold. It wasn't long before Sophia stopped speaking to me directly. She would talk about me in the third person even as I sat nearby. "Daniel," she'd say, "your mother means well, but maybe for the wedding, it would be better to keep things streamlined." Streamlined. Another word that meant erased. Daniel rarely challenged her. Instead, he shifted in his chair, his eyes avoiding mine. One evening, while I prepared supper, I overheard her voice through the hallway. "We can't risk her presence. She'll change the atmosphere. Everything we've worked for could look small town if she's in the pictures." My breath caught. Change the atmosphere. Small town. I set down the knife I was using to chop vegetables and steadied myself against the counter. When they joined me in the dining room moments later, I smiled, served the food, and said nothing. My silence was not weakness. It was memory. I remembered nights when Michael told me silence can be sharper than any argument. I remembered the sacrifices I had made so Daniel could live without hunger or fear. And I remembered that love, when true, does not require constant defense. Still, the ache grew. Sophia was no longer merely a guest in our lives. She was rewriting the script. In her story, I was an inconvenient footnote. In Daniel's, I was beginning to wonder if I appeared at all. Margaret saw it too. One afternoon, she joined me on the porch. She lit a cigarette, exhaled, and said, "Teresa, she's cutting the threads one by one. You either tie them back or let them fall." I folded Michael's handkerchief in my lap, smoothing its edges until they aligned perfectly. I can't fight her directly. That would give her exactly what she wants. I'll wait. The truth always arrives, even if late. I believed it then. Yet deep down, I knew the distance was widening. The woman sitting across from me at dinners, smiling for appearances, had already decided. In her version of the future, I had no seat at the table. The moment came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I had invited Daniel over, just the two of us, hoping to steal back a fragment of the closeness we once shared. I made his favorite roast chicken, the kind I used to cook when he was a boy studying for exams, the kind Michael used to carve at the head of the table. I set the dining room simply. Candles, polished silver, fresh roses from the garden. When he arrived, he looked sharp in his navy suit, but the way he lingered near the doorway told me he wasn't here to eat. We sat across from each other, the candles flickering between us. For a while, we spoke politely, about his work, about traffic, about nothing. The chicken cooled untouched. Finally, I folded my hands and asked, "Daniel, do you really believe it's better for me not to be at your wedding?" He flinched, just slightly, then straightened his shoulders. "Mom, it's complicated. Sophia wants a certain atmosphere, a certain image. She thinks your presence might shift things." "Shift things," I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "Do you believe that too?" His eyes darted away. He swirled the wine in his glass before answering. "It's not about belief. It's about perception. You've worked hard your whole life, Mom, but sometimes people don't understand. They see the estate. They see the history. And—" He trailed off, searching for words that wouldn't wound, but silence filled the gap. I leaned forward. "Do you think I would embarrass you?" He hesitated. That hesitation was sharper than any answer. I thought of the boy who once clutched my neck at graduations, the young man who had whispered he wanted me in the front row of everything. That boy was gone. In his place sat a man torn between love and appearances, between truth and a carefully polished facade. I chose not to raise my voice. I let the pause linger until he finally said, "Mom, it's just better this way. Please understand. It's not personal." Not personal. The words landed like stones. What could be more personal than erasing your own mother from your vows? I lifted Michael's handkerchief from my lap, smoothing it between my fingers. "Daniel," I said quietly, "this estate, this life, everything you stand on was built from nights without sleep, meals skipped, debts paid with my hands. If my presence ruins the mood, then perhaps the mood is not worth preserving." His jaw tightened. "That's not fair. Sophia wants a certain vision." "And what do you want?" I asked, my eyes meeting his. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then whispered, "I want peace." Peace, the same word Michael had underlined twice in his final note. I swallowed hard, torn between fury and grief. "You think peace comes from erasing me?" I said softly. "But peace cannot be built on absence, Daniel. One day you will discover that." He pushed his chair back, his appetite gone, his composure cracking. "I should go. Sophia's waiting." I watched him leave, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The roast chicken sat untouched, the roses wilting in the candlelight. I sat in silence, clutching the handkerchief, breathing slowly. Inside me, a war raged, love battling disappointment, memory clashing with reality. I wanted to call him back, to beg him to see me, but I stayed still. Begging had no place here. Michael once told me silence can be the sharpest boundary. That night, I finally understood. When the door closed, I whispered to the empty room, "You may erase me from your wedding, but you cannot erase me from the truth." And with those words, I knew the distance between us had grown into something vast, something I could not bridge with casseroles or conversations. I had faced my son and heard his choice. My silence would be my answer. The night after Daniel left my table, I sat alone in Michael's study. I had not stepped into that room for weeks. Dust lingered on the bookshelves, and the faint smell of old leather and cedar clung to the air. His fountain pen still rested in its holder, the same pen he had used to sign the final documents, placing Whitmore Estate in my name. I reached for it, feeling the weight of the metal against my palm. It was heavier than I remembered, or perhaps my hand had grown weaker with age. I lit the desk lamp, its circle of light falling across stacks of old ledgers. The familiar columns of numbers steadied me. Once, those numbers had kept us afloat through recessions, storms, and hospital bills. Now, they would remind me that I was not powerless. I called Howard, an old friend of Michael's, and a lawyer who had seen us through every contract from the earliest days. His voice crackled through the line, warm but cautious. "Teresa, it's late. What's wrong?" I told him everything: the text, the exclusion, the silence I had chosen instead of pleading. There was a pause. Then he said, "You've always been the backbone of that estate. If they think they can erase you, they've forgotten whose signature makes everything possible." "I don't want revenge, Howard," I whispered. "I want dignity. I want to remind my son that this foundation was built with sacrifice, not just photographs." He sighed. "Then you know what you have to do. Bring me the contracts in the morning. We'll review the clauses. If they've booked through your companies, you have every right to end the agreements." After the call, I opened the safe behind Michael's desk. My fingers spun the combination by memory, and the heavy door clicked open. Inside were deeds, insurance papers, and a stack of neatly bound contracts. I pulled them out one by one, laying them flat across the desk. Each bore my name, not Daniel's, not Sophia's. Mine. Whitmore Estate, Whitmore Catering, Whitmore Hospitality. 3 pillars of an empire they had mistaken for scenery. I smoothed the pages with Michael's handkerchief, the one embroidered with our initials. Its fabric, worn thin with years of use, felt like a blessing across the paper. I thought of all the nights I had wiped Daniel's tears with that cloth, how it had once symbolized comfort. Tonight, it was resolve. The more I read, the calmer I became. Every line of fine print confirmed what I already knew. Nothing could move forward without my approval. They had built their wedding plans on a foundation I alone controlled, and I would not allow myself to be erased from it. As midnight passed, I poured myself a cup of tea and stared out the study window. The estate stretched beyond the glass, its lawns silver under moonlight. For a moment, I saw Michael walking the grounds, his stride sure, his shoulders strong. I heard his voice: "Protect what we built. It will protect you." The next morning, I met Howard at his office downtown. The building was modest, nothing like the glossy firms Daniel admired, but its walls held decades of honesty. Howard spread the contracts across the table, scanning quickly. He nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Ironclad. You can withdraw consent at any time. They assumed your silence was approval. They assumed wrong." I signed the cancellation orders with Michael's pen, the ink flowing black and steady. My hand did not tremble. With each signature, I felt a layer of grief fall away, replaced by a quiet strength. When the last paper was complete, Howard leaned back and looked at me. "Are you ready for the storm this will bring?" I folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it in my purse. I've lived through bigger storms, and silence can weather anything. On the drive back, I passed the Florist's shop where Sophia had placed her extravagant orders. The windows glittered with arrangements, roses, lilies, orchids, all destined for a wedding that would no longer be held in my halls. I parked across the street for a moment, watching young brides-to-be enter with excitement. None of them knew me. None of them knew the history of the estate they admired in magazines. That anonymity, once painful, now felt like armor. By the time I reached home, the sun was high. I walked the grounds slowly, my hand trailing across the stone walls Michael had laid. I whispered, almost to the air itself, "It's done." For the first time since Daniel's text, I felt a breath of peace. Not joy, not triumph. Peace. It did not take long for the cancellations to ripple outward like cracks in glass. 2 days after I signed the orders, the phone calls began. First, it was the florist, then the band, then the photography studio. Each had received the same message. The event at Whitmore Estate was no longer authorized. Deposits were frozen, contracts voided. The foundation of their grand celebration had collapsed overnight. I did not hear from Daniel immediately. Instead, I heard from the vendors. The hotel manager called to confirm the cancellation of 200 room reservations. He sounded almost apologetic. "Mrs. Whitmore, we wanted to double-check. It's unusual to see such a large event vanish all at once." I assured him it was correct. His silence carried a weight I had grown familiar with. The pause people take when they realize they underestimated you. By evening, the emails began flooding in. Subject lines shouted, "Urgent," "Confirmation needed," "Please call." I read them one by one, sipping tea at the same kitchen table where I had read Daniel's text. Sophia's name appeared frequently in the correspondence, her tone shifting from polite inquiries to frantic demands. "This must be a mistake," she wrote to the planner. "We have already secured publicity for this wedding. The estate cannot simply withdraw." But it could, and it had. When Daniel finally called, his voice trembled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Mom, what is happening? Sophia just told me every vendor is backing out. The hotel canceled. The estate canceled. Did you do this?" I closed my eyes, gripping Michael's handkerchief, letting the silence stretch before I answered. "Daniel, nothing can happen on this land without my approval. You forgot that. She forgot that. But the contracts did not." His breath caught. "So, it was you. How could you humiliate me like this?" I stayed calm. "I did not humiliate you. I simply removed myself as you asked. Without me, the estate does not stand behind you. That is not humiliation. That is consequence." For a moment, all I could hear was his breathing on the line, ragged and uneven. Finally, he muttered, "Sophia is furious. She says you've ruined everything." I pressed the handkerchief to my lips, steadying myself. "I didn't ruin anything. I reminded you that everything you take for granted, every chandelier, every glass of wine, every polished stone, was built with love and still belongs to me." After the call ended, I sat in the quiet and wondered if he would ever understand. It was not revenge, it was truth. A truth that no photograph, no curated image could erase. The next morning, whispers began circulating through town. People had heard that the Whitmore wedding, expected to be the grandest event of the season, was unraveling. Some pitied Daniel, others admired the rumor of my resolve. A neighbor stopped me at the market, lowering her voice. "Teresa, is it true you canceled everything? That takes courage." I offered no confirmation, no denial. Silence served me better than gossip ever could. Sophia, however, did not stay silent. I heard she had called nearly every vendor in town, threatening lawsuits, begging for alternative venues. But without the estate, without the hotel, without the catering, her options shrank. What she had dismissed as outdated had revealed itself as indispensable. I imagined her pacing in her designer shoes, phone clutched in her hand, wondering how the woman she thought irrelevant had dismantled her plans with a single decision. The thought did not bring me joy. It brought me clarity. By the end of the week, Daniel appeared at my door. His eyes were shadowed, his suit wrinkled. He looked less like the polished lawyer and more like the boy who once came home defeated after losing a debate in school. Only this time, his anger kept him upright. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "you've made a spectacle of us." I stood in the doorway, the weight of years between us. "No, Daniel, I made a boundary. You told me my presence would ruin your wedding. So I removed not just myself, but everything tied to me. You asked for separation. I gave it to you fully." His mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer. He turned away, shoulders slumped. The fight drained from him. As he walked down the path, I whispered into the air, "You erased me. I did not erase you, but I will not stand invisible in the house I built." The news had spread far beyond our walls. What began as gossip would soon become a storm, but I was ready. The storm, after all, was mine to command. The phone rang late at night, long after the town had gone still. I sat by the window, the handkerchief folded neatly in my lap, listening to the faint hum of crickets outside. When I saw Daniel's name on the screen, my heart stuttered. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, but I answered. His voice was strained, sharp around the edges. "Mom, did you really have to go this far?" I kept my tone steady. "Far?" "Daniel, I only withdrew what was already mine. You told me not to come. I honored your wish. But without me, there is no estate, no hotel, no catering. Did you think these things stood apart from me?" There was silence. I imagined him pacing, running his hand through his hair the way he did as a teenager when he couldn't win an argument. "This isn't just about you," he said finally. "Sophia and I have put months into planning. We've sent invitations, promised people a night they won't forget. Now it's all unraveling. Everyone thinks we're a joke." I pressed the handkerchief against my lips before answering. "It's not about me, Daniel. You told me my presence would ruin your wedding. That message came from your number, not hers. You erased me. And when you erase the foundation, the house will fall." His breath hitched. "You don't understand. It's complicated." "No," I said softly. "It's simple. You asked me to vanish. I did. The estate vanished with me. That is the truth you've ignored." There was a long pause. Then his voice cracked, softer, almost pleading. "Did you have to do it this way? Couldn't you have just attended quietly without making a scene?" The words pierced me, not because of their content, but because of their blindness. "Daniel," I whispered, "I have lived my whole life attending quietly. I stood behind your father when the estate was built. I stood behind you when you took your first steps, when you left for college, when you became a man. I have spent decades being quiet, and still, you asked me to erase myself from your life. Silence has its limits." His anger flared again, though faintly. "Sophia says you're trying to control us, that this is about power, not love." I let his words hang in the air. Then, calmly, I answered, "Sophia has never understood the difference between gloss and grace. This isn't about control. It's about truth. Gloss fades, grace remains, and truth cannot be curated out of photographs. For a moment, the line was so quiet I thought he had hung up. Then he said, his voice almost breaking, "Do you even want to come? To see me get married?" My eyes stung. I pressed the handkerchief tighter, fighting back tears. "Yes," I admitted. Every mother dreams of seeing her son promise his life to someone he loves. But not like this. Not if my presence is treated as poison. I cannot attend as a ghost, Daniel. He said nothing. The silence between us stretched, waited with everything unspoken. The nights I stayed up with him through fevers. The mornings I sacrificed meals so he could eat. The years I carried his world on my back without complaint. None of that fit neatly into his carefully staged vision. Finally, he whispered, "I don't know how to fix this." "You don't have to fix it tonight," I replied. "But one day you will understand. Peace cannot be built on erasure, and love cannot be real if it demands forgetting where you came from." His breathing grew heavier, uneven. Then, abruptly, he ended the call. I set the phone down and stared at the night sky. Outside the window, the stars blinked faintly, as if trying to reach through the darkness. I thought of Michael's words, written years ago, "Choose peace when you can." Perhaps this was my peace. Not loud, not violent, but a line drawn in silence. The next morning, I found Margaret sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee. She must have known Daniel had called. She studied my face, then said, "Did he hear you?" "Only halfway," I answered. It was a dialogue without an end. She nodded. "Half the truth is still better than none. He will have to live with the other half until he's ready." I looked down at the handkerchief in my hands. The threads were thinning, but the initials Michael had embroidered remained intact. Just like me. Faded, perhaps, but not erased. That night's conversation was incomplete, unfinished, half confession and half denial. But it had given me clarity. Daniel may not have seen it yet, but the boundaries had been redrawn. And for once, I was not on the outside of the frame. The morning after Daniel's call, Margaret arrived with a small box tucked under her arm. She didn't ask permission to come in. She never had to. She had been part of my life since Michael and I were newlyweds, and her presence was as natural as the ticking clock in the kitchen. She set the box on the table and poured us both coffee before speaking. "I think you need this," she said simply. I opened the box and found a stack of old photographs, curled at the edges from years of storage. Margaret leaned back in her chair, exhaling smoke from the cigarette she always allowed herself after breakfast. "I kept these because I knew one day Daniel might forget, and if he forgot, someone had to remember." I lifted the first photo. It was of Daniel at 10 years old, his face still round with childhood, his arms wrapped around my neck. We were standing in front of the estate's first finished ballroom, the plaster still smelling of fresh paint. He had written on the back, in sloppy handwriting, "Thank you, Mom, for never leaving." My throat tightened as I traced the letters with my thumb. Photo after photo revealed moments long buried. Daniel riding on Michael's shoulders through the unfinished gardens. Daniel asleep against my chest during a late-night construction shift. Daniel beaming as I cut a ribbon for the estate's first wedding. Each image told the truth Sophia's curated world had no place for. The estate was not a backdrop. It was a history, built by hands scarred with labor and softened by love. Margaret sipped her coffee and watched me silently. Finally, she said, "He may have forgotten, But forgetting doesn't change the truth. You carried that boy through storms most men couldn't survive. Sophia can airbrush photographs, but she cannot erase memory. I swallowed hard, holding the photo with Daniel's words. Thank you, Mom, for never leaving. The irony cut deep. He had once begged me to always stay, and now he was the one who had pushed me out. I wonder if I failed him, I admitted quietly. Maybe I should have told him more about what it cost. Maybe I should have shown him the nights I went hungry so he could eat. Maybe he thinks it all came easily. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes sharp. Teresa, don't you dare blame yourself. Protecting him was not failure. It was love. But now, love requires truth. Whether he accepts it or not, that's his choice. Her words sank into me, heavy and real. For years, I had kept silent, believing sacrifice was enough, that my love would be understood without explanation. But silence, I realize now, can be misinterpreted. What I had meant as devotion, Daniel may have mistaken as absence. I set the photo down and reached for Michael's handkerchief, pressing it against my palm. The initials he embroidered were fading, but still visible. Just like me, faded, but intact. If Daniel could only see these, I whispered. Maybe he'd remember who I was to him. Margaret shook her head. He has to see it on his own. You can't force memory any more than you can force love. All you can do is hold your ground. You've done that. Now let the truth find him in its own time. Her certainty steadied me. I placed the photographs back in the box, but the one with Daniel's handwriting I kept out, tucking it into the drawer beside Michael's pen. That drawer had become a shrine of sorts. One object to mark every stage of my journey. The pen to sign, the handkerchief to endure, the photo to remind. As Margaret prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Teresa, she said softly, don't forget, silence can cut, but it can also heal. Let him feel the wound long enough to search for its source. One day, he may open his eyes. After she left, I sat at the table alone, the morning light spilling across the wood. I held the photograph again, staring at Daniel's crooked letters. Thank you, Mom, for never leaving. The words were both a promise and a betrayal, a memory and a warning. And in that moment, I understood. Even if he had forgotten, the truth had not. And the truth, in time, has a way of speaking louder than any curated image ever could. The morning of the wedding came with an unusual stillness, the kind that feels more like anticipation of a storm than celebration. I woke early, poured myself a cup of tea in the chipped china I had used for decades, and sat by the window. The estate should have been buzzing with florists and musicians, staff running across the courtyard with linens and trays of champagne. Instead, it was quiet, too quiet. Word travels fast in a small circle of luxury vendors. By canceling the contracts under my authority, I hadn't needed to speak a word. The silence of my signature had spoken for me. Calls had been made, deposits withdrawn, and reservations voided. What was once a glittering event had turned into a logistical nightmare, and Daniel and Sophia were left scrambling. From where I sat, I could see the far end of the property, the gates locked, the pathways empty. Guests who had planned to arrive the day before had been met with polite but firm notices. Accommodations unavailable. Contracts terminated. Some had turned around and gone home, their designer luggage loaded back into cars with frustrated sighs. I didn't gloat. My heart ached with every vision of Daniel's face, confused and betrayed, realizing that the mother he had dismissed held the very ground beneath his feet. I remembered him as a boy, practicing piano in the East Wing, his fingers stumbling over the keys until I clapped softly to encourage him. That boy would have run to me for comfort. The man he had become saw me as a liability. By mid-morning, the phone began to vibrate relentlessly. Unknown numbers, blocked numbers, then Daniel's name flashing again and again. I let them all ring. Silence, I reminded myself, was sometimes the sharpest blade. Later, Margaret stopped by, her face lined with both worry and restrained satisfaction. She had heard whispers from the vendors downtown. "They can't find a replacement venue," she said, lowering her voice, though the room was empty. "Dozens of guests are stranded. Even the caterer refused to take their calls. The whole thing is collapsing, Teresa." I nodded slowly, stirring my tea. I didn't do it to humiliate them. I only withdrew what was mine. Margaret reached for my hand, her grip firm. And that's the difference. This isn't revenge. It's justice in its quietest form. By noon, photographs began appearing online. Guests with nothing better to do had taken to social media, documenting the chaos. Designer dresses waiting in hotel lobbies, bouquets wilting in delivery trucks, groomsmen pacing outside shuttered gates. The caption on one particularly brutal post read, "Imagine disinviting your own mother and losing the 35-minute estate she owns." The irony cut sharper than any insult. Sophia's curated world of flawless aesthetics was unraveling in real time, pixel by pixel. The very image she sought to control had slipped from her grasp, replaced by gossip threads and scandalous speculation. In the middle of the afternoon, my phone finally went silent. No more buzzing, no more pleading, only quiet. I imagined them, somewhere in a rented hall or banquet room, stripped of chandeliers and marble staircases, trying desperately to salvage dignity. The wedding that was meant to dazzle had turned into a cautionary tale. I thought of Daniel standing at the altar, his jaw tight, his eyes darting with unease. I thought of Sophia, still beautiful, still determined, but hollowed by the absence of grandeur. I did not rejoice in their discomfort. My heart ached, but my spirit held firm. I stood and walked to the drawer where Michael's pen, his handkerchief, and Daniel's childhood photograph rested. One by one, I touched them as if to steady myself. The pen for the contracts, the handkerchief for endurance, the photo for the truth that even now lingered in his handwriting. "Thank you, Mom, for never leaving." Outside, the evening light began to settle over the garden. Birds called faintly, their song a reminder that life continued regardless of broken plans. I poured another cup of tea and sat back down, the steam curling upward like a benediction. Somewhere across town, Daniel was learning a lesson he had never expected, that silence has consequences and exclusion has a cost. Sophia, too, was learning that curated images cannot withstand the weight of erased foundations. As for me, I felt neither victory nor defeat, only a strange calm. For the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't apologizing. I wasn't paying for rejection. I was simply being. And in the quiet of that evening, I realized the wedding had already given me something more precious than celebration. It had given me my voice back, a voice I had thought long buried beneath sacrifice. 2 days after the wedding collapsed, my phone finally rang with a name I hadn't expected. Anna, my younger sister. She lived 3 states away, kept mostly to herself, and rarely involved herself in family affairs. Yet her voice carried urgency. "Teresa, what on earth happened? I've been getting calls from relatives nonstop. They're saying you canceled Daniel's wedding. that you left him humiliated in front of everyone. I closed my eyes, steadying my breath. I didn't cancel his wedding, Anna. I canceled the use of my estate, my hotel, my catering. The wedding was never mine to destroy, but it was built on foundations that were. Her silence was heavy. Finally, she asked, "So it's true?" "Yes," I said. "It's true." Within hours, other family members began reaching out. Nieces, cousins, even Michael's brother from Florida. Some were curious, others judgmental. A few applauded me in whispers, while others condemned me outright. "How could you do that to your only son?" one cousin asked bitterly. "A mother's role is to support, not sabotage." The word sabotage burned. I had supported him all his life. I had been the invisible scaffold, holding everything up while Michael pursued his vision, while Daniel grew into his ambitions. To be accused of sabotage now felt like being erased twice over. That evening, Daniel's aunt, Margaret's sister Ruth, stopped by uninvited. Her presence filled the living room with a chill sharper than the autumn wind outside. "Teresa," she began, without sitting, "the family is in shock. They don't understand why you'd embarrass Daniel like this." I folded Michael's handkerchief in my lap, keeping my voice calm. "Ruth, I did not embarrass him. I only withdrew myself as he requested. Without me, there is no estate. That truth embarrassed him, perhaps, but I did not." Her eyes narrowed. "You've always been stubborn. But this was cruel." "Cruel," I repeated softly. "Cruel is asking a mother not to witness her son's vows. Cruel is pretending her presence poisons the air. What I did was not cruelty. It was clarity." She shook her head, muttering, "People will never forget this," before walking out. When the door shut, I sat back, my chest tight. Family, the very thing I had fought so hard to preserve, was fracturing under the weight of judgment. It wasn't only Daniel and Sophia who had turned against me. Now cousins, aunts, even old friends were dividing into camps. The cost of truth was higher than I had imagined. Later that night, Margaret returned, sensing my turmoil. She listened quietly as I poured out the accusations I had endured all day. Finally, she placed her hand over mine. "Families love to rewrite stories, Teresa. They'll make you the villain because it's easier than admitting Daniel was wrong. But you and I know the truth. And truth has a way of surviving long after gossip dies." Her words calmed me, but only slightly, because deep down, a question gnawed at me. Had I gone too far? Had I given Sophia exactly what she wanted? Proof, to wave in front of Daniel, that his mother was destructive, vindictive, unworthy. I thought again of the photograph with Daniel's childish handwriting. "Thank you, Mom, for never leaving." The words now felt like both accusation and salvation. I had never left. He had erased me. And when the foundation crumbled, the family saw only the rubble, not the years of quiet labor that had built the walls in the first place. The next morning, my phone buzzed with another unexpected call. This time from Daniel's cousin Emily, a young woman barely in her 20s. Her voice was hesitant. "Aunt Teresa, I just wanted to say, I think you were brave. Everyone's talking, but I saw Sophia scream at the florist the week before. She treated them like servants. She never respected what you built. Maybe now Daniel will finally see." Her small voice cracked something inside me. Not all of the family believed the whispers. Some still saw me, even if faintly. After the call ended, I walked through the estate gardens, the autumn leaves crunching beneath my feet. The house stood silent, but not broken. And neither was I. The family's shock had shaken me to the core. Yes. But within that fracture lay a hidden strength. The knowledge that even in the face of judgment, I had stood for myself at last. It was a Tuesday morning when the letter arrived, tucked among the usual stack of bills and circulars. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The ivory envelope bore Daniel's name in neat type, and the return address belonged to the wedding planner. I assumed it was another formality misplaced by the postman. But curiosity tugged at me, and I slid it open with Michael's old letter opener. Inside was a printed email chain, clearly meant for Daniel, but somehow routed to me. As I scanned the lines, my hands trembled. It was Sophia's correspondence with the planner, sent in the weeks before the wedding. Daniel's mother is a liability, she had written. She carries herself as though she still matters. The estate is hers in name, yes, but emotionally, she's a relic. We cannot let her presence overshadow the image we're creating. The words hit like a fist to my chest. A relic. I pressed Michael's handkerchief to my lips, trying to steady the sharp tremor of my breath. Another line followed. Convince Daniel that excluding her is best for everyone. He'll resist at first, but he's pliable when reminded that appearances matter. Once she's out of the picture, no one will question our control. I set the letter down, my vision blurring. The truth was harsher than I had imagined. Daniel's exclusion of me wasn't born entirely of his own will. It had been nudged, coaxed, manipulated by Sophia's ambition. She had seen me not as a mother, not as the builder of a legacy, but as an obstacle to a race. Margaret arrived later that morning, bringing bread still warm from her oven. She found me at the table, the letter spread open, my fingers clutching the edges so tightly the paper threatened to tear. She read it silently, then looked at me with fury in her eyes. Teresa, she played him. She poisoned him against you. I nodded, swallowing back the ache in my throat. I suspected as much, but suspicion is one thing. Seeing it in her own words, it cuts deeper than I thought possible. Margaret reached across the table, her grip grounding me. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about Daniel seeing the truth. He's blind now, but this letter is a mirror. One day, he'll have to look. That evening, I placed the letter in the drawer beside the photograph and Michael's pen. 3 artifacts now, each one a piece of the story. The pen of power, the photo of memory, the letter of betrayal. Together, they formed a truth Daniel could not ignore forever. For days, I wrestled with what to do. Should I confront him with the letter? Should I send it back without a word? Or should I keep it hidden, letting time itself reveal what words could not? Each night, I walked the garden paths, autumn leaves crackling underfoot, whispering questions to the wind. I thought of Michael, of how he would weigh justice against peace. He would remind me that truth, when forced, becomes another weapon. But when revealed gently at the right moment, it becomes salvation. In the end, I chose silence, not cowardice, but patience. The letter was not mine to weaponize. It was Daniel's to discover when his heart was ready. Until then, it would rest with the other artifacts of truth, waiting. But its arrival shifted something within me. For the first time, I understood with piercing clarity that Sophia's cruelty was not mine to bear. She had written me off as a relic, yes, but relics endure. Relics outlast the fleeting fashions that dismiss them. That night, as I folded Michael's handkerchief and placed it gently beside the letter, I whispered to myself, I am not erased. I am the ink that built these pages, and one day, he will read them. The letter had been sent to the wrong address, or perhaps to the only address it was always meant to find. The letter lingered in my thoughts long after I tucked it away. Days passed, yet its words echoed through every corner of the estate. A relic, a liability, erase her presence. Each phrase clung like frost on glass, refusing to melt. I found myself retracing old memories, not of Sophia's cruelty, but of my own choices, the years of silence, the sacrifices I had made, without ever speaking of their weight. I began to wonder if Daniel's blindness was entirely his own. Had I taught him, unknowingly, that silence meant acceptance, that my absence was something natural, expected, rather than the wound it truly was? One evening, I returned to the East Wing, where Michael's portrait hung. Dust had gathered on the frame, and I wiped it clean with the edge of his handkerchief. His eyes, captured in paint, seemed to study me. I spoke aloud, as though he might answer. Did I fail him, Michael? By protecting him from the cost of what we built, did I let him believe it was effortless? The room held no reply, only the faint creak of old wood. Yet in that silence, I heard my own voice answering back. Yes, I had hidden too much. In my devotion to shielding Daniel from hardship, I had erased part of myself. I had taught him to see the estate as inheritance, not as sacrifice. That realization cut deep, but it also gave me clarity. My power did not come from contracts or signatures alone. It came from the truth I had lived, the truth I had chosen to bury beneath years of quiet endurance. I walked the gardens the next morning, the crisp air filling my lungs. Each stone, each hedge, each archway whispered of nights spent calculating costs, of mornings spent negotiating with laborers, of afternoons when Michael and I patched walls with our own hands. It was not Daniel's fault he had not seen those things. He had been a child, but he was no longer a child, and it was no longer my duty to shelter him from the truth. Margaret visited that afternoon, carrying her usual basket of bread. She studied me carefully, noticing the change in my face. "You look lighter," she said. "I've been thinking," I admitted. Perhaps I wasn't erased by Daniel, or by Sophia. Perhaps I erased myself first, by never telling him the full story of what it cost to build this place. He only saw the finished halls, never the sleepless nights. Margaret nodded, her eyes kind but firm. "That may be true, but silence isn't failure, Teresa. It was love. And now love must look different. It must be honest." Her words steadied me. For the first time, I saw my silence not as weakness, but as a chapter. One chapter could end, and another could begin. That evening, I sat at Michael's desk with his pen in hand. Instead of contracts, I opened a fresh journal. I began writing, not for Daniel, not for Sophia, but for myself. I wrote about the nights of worry, the loans Michael and I took, the meals skipped, the hope we clung to when everything seemed impossible. I wrote about holding Daniel as a fever burned through him, whispering promises that tomorrow would be better because I would make it so. The words flowed like a river long dammed. Page after page, I poured out the truth I had hidden. It was painful, but with each sentence, the ache in my chest eased. I wasn't writing to accuse or to defend. I was writing to remember myself. When I closed the journal, the handkerchief rested beside it, folded neatly. I touched it gently and whispered, "I am not a relic. I am the root. And even if the branches turn away, the root remains." For the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully, Not because Daniel had returned, not because the family's judgment had softened, but because I had reclaimed something far more important than approval: my own voice. The journal I could begun filled faster than I expected. Each night, I poured myself into its pages, writing the truths I had never spoken aloud. But as the days passed, a thought kept pressing against my mind. Daniel might never come here searching. He might never ask for the stories I had hidden. And if I carried them silently to my grave, then Sophia's words, that I was a relic, forgotten and irrelevant, would linger as prophecy instead of lie. One evening, after a long walk through the gardens, I returned to Michael's study and sat at his desk. I took out a single sheet of parchment, heavier than ordinary paper, the kind Michael used for his most important letters. I uncapped his fountain pen, dipped it into ink, and began to write. "Dear Daniel," I began, my hand trembling but steadying as the words formed. "I do not know if you will read this with anger or sorrow. Perhaps you will never read it at all. But I need you to know the truth before it fades into silence." I told him of the sacrifices, the debts Michael and I carried, the hunger I endured, the nights I walked the grounds alone while he slept safe in his bed. I told him how every brick, every chandelier, every polished floor was bought not with ease, but with sweat and tears. I did not accuse. I did not beg. I wrote with the same quiet dignity I had tried to live with. You told me not to come to your wedding, that my presence would spoil the mood. But Daniel, my presence has been the mood of your entire life. Without me, there would have been no estate to rent, no roof to cover you, no table to feed you. If you cannot see that now, perhaps one day you will. As I wrote, I pressed Michael's handkerchief to the edge of the page, leaving a faint watermark where my tears had fallen. I left that mark, deliberately, proof that this letter had been born of love, not bitterness. I added only one request at the end. If the day comes when you feel lost, look in the drawer of my desk. You will find a photograph, a letter not meant for me but sent to me, and this. They will tell you what I no longer can. When I signed my name, Teresa Whitmore, the ink spread across the page like a seal. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and sealed it with a drop of wax. Then I slipped it into the drawer alongside the photograph with Daniel's childish handwriting and the letter Sophia had written to the planner. 3 artifacts of memory, betrayal, and truth, guarded now by a final message only he could one day open. That night, I sat by the fire with Margaret. I didn't tell her what I had written, only that I felt lighter, as though a burden I had carried for decades had finally found a resting place. She studied me closely and said, "Sometimes the most powerful words are not the ones spoken in anger, but the ones left behind for when someone is ready to hear them." Her words sank deep. I realized that the letter was not about forcing Daniel to change. It was about giving him a map when he was ready to search for one. I had done all I could in life. The rest was his journey. Before bed, I returned to the study once more, opened the drawer, and touched the envelope gently. I whispered, "If you ever come back to me, let it be through truth, not obligation." Then I closed the drawer and let the silence of the house embrace me. That night, for the first time since his wedding fell apart, I slept without dreams. Not because I had found peace with Daniel, but because I had found peace with myself. The day of Daniel's rescheduled wedding arrived with none of the grandeur Sophia had once promised. Word had spread quickly that the Whitmore estate was no longer available, and no amount of frantic bargaining could restore what had been lost. They chose instead a small banquet hall in the city, a place meant for conferences and charity luncheons rather than vows. I did not receive an invitation, of course, but I heard whispers, through Margaret, through neighbors, through the very vendors who had once worked exclusively with me. Everyone knew. Everyone was talking. And though I tried to quiet my curiosity, I could not silence the ache in my chest. On the morning of the wedding, I walked the estate gardens slowly, imagining how it might have looked if things had been different. The arches draped with roses, the chandeliers glittering, the music floating through the halls. I pictured Daniel at the altar, tall and steady, and for a moment I almost allowed myself the fantasy that I was there, watching proudly. But fantasies dissolve quickly when truth intrudes. And the truth was that across town, my son was marrying in a hall lined with gray carpeting and fluorescent lights. Margaret later described it with brutal honesty. It felt more like a trade show than a wedding. Guests whispered, some left early. The joy never filled the room. As she spoke, I pictured Daniel standing at the front, his tie perfectly knotted, his face stiff with the effort of control. Sophia beside him, radiant as always, but her smile brittle, forced. Behind them, no marble staircase, no shimmering crystal, only a plain backdrop that mocked the image she had tried so desperately to curate. Guests murmured about the absence of the estate, about the canceled contracts, about the mother who had not been invited. Some speculated I had chosen to stay away in bitterness. Others whispered that Sophia had engineered it. The air was heavy with unease, and every toast sounded hollow. I did not need to be there to feel it. I knew in my bones what a wedding without warmth felt like. Cold, empty. A ceremony draped in appearances, but stripped of spirit. Margaret told me that at one point, during the vows, Daniel faltered. His voice cracked as he promised devotion. Some said it was nerves. Others said it was doubt. Margaret swore his eyes flickered as though searching for something, or someone, missing. Hearing that nearly broke me. Because I knew, despite everything, that part of him must have felt the absence like a shadow at his back. A boy who once clutched me during thunderstorms could not stand at the altar without remembering whose arms once held him safe. When the ceremony ended, guests shuffled out quickly, their conversations muted. The reception offered no reprieve. Without the estate's grandeur, the photographs looked flat, the food uninspired, the music lifeless. One vendor confided later, it was the kind of wedding people forget before dessert. I sat by the fire that night, holding the photograph Daniel had once signed with childish scrawl. "Thank you, Mom, for never leaving." The irony weighed heavy. I had not left. I had been pushed aside, erased, treated as though my presence were a blemish. And yet, in erasing me, they had erased the soul of their own celebration. The wedding had gone on, yes. Papers were signed, rings exchanged. But joy, true joy, had been absent. What should have been a day of light had turned into a performance under cold fluorescent bulbs. And so, as the flames flickered in the hearth, I realized something. I did not need to see the hollow ceremony with my own eyes. The whispers, the descriptions, the weight of absence, they were enough. My presence, denied, had spoken louder than I ever could have in person. The Hon Lelan Leo had revealed the truth more starkly than any confrontation. When love is stripped of respect, when family is severed from its roots, the result is not celebration. It is emptiness, dressed as festivity. I set the photograph down, folded the handkerchief, and whispered into the silence of the house. They can marry without me, but they cannot find warmth without truth. And in that whisper, I found a measure of peace. In the weeks following Daniel's cold wedding, the estate felt heavier, quieter than usual. Yet within that stillness, I began to sense something unexpected stirring inside me. Not bitterness, not grief, but a fragile seed of new belief. For the first time in many years, I realized my life did not have to revolve around waiting for Daniel's approval, or Sophia's acceptance, or the family's judgment. My life, long and bruised as it was, still belonged to me. One morning, I walked through the East Garden at dawn. The roses Michael had planted decades ago were beginning to wilt with the season, but small green shoots peeked from the soil. I bent down and touched one tender sprout with my fingers. Life was still pushing through, even after storms, even after frost. That simple sight sparked something in me. I whispered aloud, "If the garden can begin again, so can I." I carried that thought with me into the house. Instead of sitting by the fire clutching old artifacts, I began opening windows, letting fresh air into rooms long sealed. I hired a few workers to restore parts of the estate that had fallen into quiet neglect. It wasn't about hosting another grand event or proving anything to anyone. It was about breathing life into spaces that had carried too much sorrow. Margaret noticed the change almost immediately. When she visited with her basket of bread, she found me dusting shelves in the library, a broom propped against the wall. "Teresa," she said with surprise, "what on earth are you doing cleaning yourself when you own half the county?" I laughed softly, something I hadn't done in weeks. "I'm not cleaning for guests. I'm cleaning for me. For once, this house doesn't need to impress anyone. It just needs to feel alive again." That afternoon, I wrote in my journal with a steadier hand. The entries shifted from painful recollections to quiet dreams. I wrote about maybe teaching young people the history of this estate, not the glossy version for magazines, but the true story of work and sacrifice. I imagined opening the gardens for the community, letting school children wander through the archways, giving them a glimpse of beauty that wasn't tied to wealth or exclusion. The more I wrote, the lighter I felt. My story was no longer one of erasure, but of endurance. I began to understand that legacy wasn't about who applauded you or who invited you to sit in the front row. Legacy was the love you left woven into the world, invisible threads that continued long after arguments ended. One evening, I sat with Margaret on the porch as the sun dipped low. She sipped her coffee while I held Michael's handkerchief, folded neatly. "Do you think Daniel will ever come back?" I asked quietly. She looked at me with her steady gaze. Maybe not. But Teresa, life is not about waiting for someone to see you. It's about seeing yourself. And I think you've begun to do that. Her words settled deep in me. For so long, I had defined myself through what I gave, through who I carried. Now I was learning to define myself simply by being. The next morning, I placed the photograph Daniel had signed as a child on the mantel, not hidden away in the drawer. I wanted it in plain sight, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that once, love had been real and freely given. Love like that cannot vanish completely. It only hides beneath layers of hurt. As days turned into weeks, I noticed subtle changes. I rose earlier, tended the garden longer, lingered less over the silence of the phone. I still missed my son deeply, but I no longer sat paralyzed by his rejection. My heart ached, yes, but it beat with new rhythm, a rhythm that belonged to me. One evening, as I watched the fire crackle, I whispered to myself, I am not erased. I am still here, and being here is enough. That was my new faith. Not faith that Daniel would apologize, not faith that Sophia would fall from her pedestal, but faith in myself. Faith that even in solitude, a woman who has endured, who has built, who has sacrificed, still holds value. The estate, once a cage of memory, had become again a sanctuary. And I, Teresa Whitmore, once called a relic, had found a new belief, that it is never too late to begin again. The season shifted slowly from autumn into winter, and with it, a certain calmness settled over me. The estate, once heavy with silence, now felt lighter. The rooms I had reopened filled with sunlight in the mornings, and the gardens, though stripped of blossoms, carried the promise of spring beneath the soil. I began to feel that my story was not one of endings, but of openings, doors I had not thought to walk through until now. I often found myself in the library, writing in the journal that had become my companion. Page after page carried not only memory, but also reflections on what it means to endure, to lose, and to rise again. I didn't write for Daniel anymore. I didn't write for Sophia or the family that whispered. I wrote for women like me, women who had given, who had been dismissed, who wondered if they had any worth left once their children turned away. And sometimes, late at night, I imagined one of those women hearing my story. I imagined her sitting in her own quiet house, listening to these words, and realizing she was not alone. That thought gave me strength, as though the pain I carried could be transformed into something gentler, something useful. Daniel had not returned. I did not know if he ever would. But the letter I had written, sealed in my drawer, no longer haunted me. It was there for him if he chose to seek it, and if he never did, it would remain a truth preserved, like a seed waiting for the right season. Margaret continued to visit, and sometimes we laughed more than we mourned. "You look lighter," she said one morning as we watched the frost glitter across the lawn. "As though you've stopped carrying everyone else on your back." I smiled, holding Michael's handkerchief, now carefully pressed and placed in a small wooden box with the photograph and the letter. Perhaps I finally realized I was allowed to put the weight down. The truth was, I didn't need reconciliation to find peace. I didn't need an apology to reclaim myself. What I needed was to see clearly that my life, with all its trials, still held beauty and worth. That knowledge was enough. And so I began to open the estate, just as I had once dreamed. Not for weddings or lavish spectacles, but for the community. School children came to walk the gardens, their laughter echoing through halls that had grown too used to silence. Teachers asked me to speak about history, about perseverance, about the truth behind the grandeur. I told them stories of Michael laying bricks with calloused hands, of nights when candlelight was our only power. The children listened, wide-eyed, and I felt alive in a way I hadn't for years. I did not tell them about Daniel's rejection. That part of the story was mine alone. But as I spoke, I knew that somewhere, perhaps years from now, he might also hear whispers of what I had done. Not the scandal, not the erasure, but the giving back. And maybe then, he would remember. One evening, after a long day of hosting children in the gardens, I sat by the fire and spoke softly into the stillness. "Michael, we did it. Even in the end, what we built is still giving life." The flames crackled, the shadows danced, and in that moment, I felt held. not by reconciliation, not by victory, but by quiet grace. And now, to you who are listening to my story, I want to ask, what would you have done if you were me? Would you have stepped back silently, or would you have drawn a line like I did? Have you ever been told you were no longer needed, even by those you carried? If you have ever felt erased, I hope you hear me now. You are not gone. You are still here. Your presence matters, even when others fail to see it. Tell me, have you lived something like this? Do you believe silence can be power? If you do, or if you don't, I would love to know your thoughts. Leave your words. Share your story. Let this not be just mine, but ours. Because in the end, healing is not about being seen by those who turned away. It is about remembering that you have always been enough, exactly as you are.